Ever think about like how the very act of believing can like change the strategic landscape? Like how we think about knowledge, it's not just passively taking in facts, but it's like an active part of the games we play. Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're looking at where epistemology and game theory meet. Epistemic game theory. We'll be going over the basic assumptions behind our rational decisions, especially when others are involved, with a focus on, what roles knowledge and belief play.
Yeah, definitely. So what we're looking at today comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the entry on epistemic foundations of game theory. It's a pretty thorough look at the whole field.
Yeah.
What we're going to do today is unpack how game theory, which often seems like it's all about predicting strategic moves, actually interacts with epistemology, which is the philosophical study of the nature and scope of knowledge and belief. We want to understand not just the strategic interaction, but also the foundation of rational choice in these situations.
Okay, so where do we start unraveling this connection between games and how we understand knowledge?
It makes sense to start with classical game theory. At its core, a game, at least in this technical sense, is any situation where you have people acting in their own interest and they make decisions that affect each other. You can think of it like an interdependent decision problem. Schelling actually talked about this back in 1960.
So what makes up one of these games? What are the essential parts?
There are a few key components. First, you've got the players. And in our discussion, we'll be focusing on games that have a set number of players. Then there are the feasible actions or strategies each player can take. We'll mostly be looking at situations where each player has a limited set of options to choose from. Finally, you have the player's preferences over the potential outcomes. These are often represented by utility functions, which assign a value to how much a player desires a certain outcome.
Right, so it's all about the players, what they can do and what they want. So how do these things actually come together in a game?
So when every player chooses what they're going to do, all those choices make up a strategy profile. This profile then determines what the actual outcome of the game will be. When looking at a specific player, we can separate their individual choice in the profile from the choices everyone else made.
Okay, got it. Can you give us a quick example to show us how this basic structure works?
Sure, let's take the classic pure coordination game. Imagine two people, Ann and Bob. Ann can pick, let's say, U for up or D for down, and Bob can choose L for left or R for right. Let's say they both get a big reward if they pick U, L, or DR, but a much smaller reward if they pick U, R, and DR. They both want to coordinate, but it doesn't really matter which way they coordinate.
That sounds a lot like when two philosophers are trying to decide on which conference to go to, where they both benefit from going to the same one but don't really care which one it is.
Exactly. And we can actually put this whole scenario with all the possible combinations of actions and the payoffs they get into a simple table or a matrix. Now, to figure out what might happen in a game like this, classical game theory uses something called solution concepts. These are tools that help us figure out which outcomes we can think of as rational. Now, there are two ways to think about this rationality. We can think of it as a prediction of what players will actually do, or we can think of it as a recommendation for what players should do.
And I guess one of the most famous solution concepts is the Nash equilibrium, right?
You got it. A Nash equilibrium describes a situation where if all the other players are keeping their strategies the same, no single player can get a better outcome by changing their own strategy on their own. So in our coordination game, the two situations where Ann and Bob both coordinate UL and DR are actually both pure strategy Nash equilibria. If they're in one of those situations, neither of them is going to want to switch their choice if they think the other one will stay with theirs.
So that's the basic idea behind classical game theory. Now, how does epistemic game theory build on that, or maybe even challenge it?
This is where the philosophy stuff gets really interesting. Epistemic game theory looks at things from a Bayesian point of view. Like the philosopher Robert Stalnaker said, when you're in a game, the things other players do are basically uncertain facts about the world, just like any other thing you don't know. So that means what you believe they will do is really important when you're trying to decide what the rational thing for you to do is.
So it's not just about the structure of the game itself, but also about what's going on inside the players' heads, their beliefs, and how they think.
You got it. Normal decision theory says that to make a rational choice, you need to consider your preferences and your beliefs about how the world is. Epistemic game theory says that classical game theory is missing something. It's not enough to just look at the players, their actions, and their preferences. We also need to think about what the players believe about what each other will do, and even what they believe about those beliefs, those higher order beliefs.
It sounds like we're moving into a much more complex understanding of strategic interaction here, something that really gets at the core of how we think.
Absolutely. Epistemic game theory is all about the idea that games don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in specific contexts, and those contexts include all the knowledge and beliefs that the players have. So a move that might seem rational if you have one set of beliefs could be completely irrational if you have a different set of beliefs, even if the game itself hasn't changed.
So a big part of this is dealing with all the uncertainty, especially when it comes to figuring out what your opponents are going to do.
Exactly. Games can have lots of different types of uncertainty. You might be uncertain about the rules of the game, what happened in the past, and so on. But for epistemic game theory, the most important type of uncertainty is strategic uncertainty. So when we try to decide if a player's move is rational, we have to look at both their preferences and what they believe about the strategies their opponents will use. Stallnaker's point is really important here. There aren't separate sets of rules for rationality when you're interacting with others versus when you're not. It's still all about figuring out what you believe is going to happen and then acting in a way that will give you the best outcome based on those beliefs.
It's kind of like classical game theory gives you the rule book for the game, but then epistemic game theory goes inside the players' heads to figure out how they understand that rule book and how they decide what moves to make.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. And because it focuses on how each player thinks within a specific context, epistemic game theory usually takes a bottom-up approach. You start by defining the context, all the players' knowledge and beliefs, and then you can work out what the rational outcomes will be. That's different from the top-down approach of classical game theory, which often just tells you what the rational outcomes are without really explaining how the players would arrive at those outcomes.
Okay, so how do we model these complicated contexts? How do we represent all these beliefs and knowledge that the players have?
Well, that's where game models come in. There are basically two main ways to do this. You can use quantitative methods, which use probabilities to show how strong someone's belief is, or you can use qualitative methods, which deal with more absolute ideas like knowledge and belief. Frameworks like type spaces and Ullmann-Kripke structures are really important for formalizing these ideas.
And I guess within these models, there are different ways to represent the different types of beliefs we can have.
Exactly. We can distinguish between hard information, which is generally thought to be true, and that you can't change your mind about often compared to the philosophical idea of knowledge. And then you have soft information, like beliefs, which can change when you get new information. The field of dynamic epistemic logic has been really helpful in studying these distinctions and how they change over time.
You mentioned relational models or Ullmann-Kripke structures. Can you tell me more about those? How do they help us model knowledge?
So these models use the idea of possible worlds. Basically, imagine all the different scenarios that could happen. For every player, there's an equivalence relation between these possible worlds. This tells you which worlds the player sees as being the same based on the hard information they have. If something is true in every possible world that a player can't distinguish from the actual world, then we say that the player knows that thing. This way of defining knowledge matches up well with the ideas captured by the S5 system in epistemic logic.
So it's about dividing up all the possibilities into groups based on what each player knows.
Exactly. The equivalence relation basically splits up all the possible worlds into information cells for each player. Now, to model beliefs, which are more flexible, we made a small but important change. Instead of needing the relation to be reflexive, meaning every world is considered possible relative to itself, which is a key part of knowledge, is we use a serial relation. That means for every world, there's at least one other world that's considered possible. This seriality ensures that beliefs are consistent in the model. You can't believe something that's contradictory.
But we know beliefs can change when we learn new things. How do these models deal with that?
Well, that's where plausibility orderings become important. For each player, we have a pre-order, a relation that's reflexive and transitive on the possible worlds. If a player thinks world W is at least as plausible as world V, we write that as W presec of V. This lets us rank all the different possible worlds based on how likely the player thinks they are. These plausibility orderings usually have properties like plausibility implies possibility, meaning if something is plausible, it can't be ruled out completely, and local connectedness, meaning that for any two possible worlds, one must be at least as plausible as the other. These properties help us make sure that the beliefs in our model make sense.
So these orderings let us show not just what someone believes, but also how strongly they believe it.
That's right. And then, using these orderings, we can define different types of soft or informational attitudes, like conditional beliefs, which tell us what a player would believe if they learned some new information.
And what about the probabilities approach? How does that work?
In this approach, instead of plausibility orderings, we give each possible world a probability. Every player, in every possible world, has a probability measure that tells us how likely they think each world is. We often assume that these probabilities are consistent with what the player knows. They give a probability of 0 to any world they know isn't possible. An important idea here is the common prior assumption, which says that all the players started with the same initial beliefs and have then updated them based on their own private information. In these probabilistic models, if a player gives an event a probability of 1, we say they believe that event.
And then there's the Harsanyi type spaces approach. That seems pretty different.
It is. John Harsanyi started with something different. Instead of possible worlds, he used the idea of a player's type. Every player has a set of possible types, and we assume that players know their own type but not the types of other players. Each type then represents a whole set of beliefs about the other player's types and the actual state of the world.
So your type tells us everything you believe about the game and everyone else playing it.
Basically, yeah. A global state in a type space is made up of the actual types of all the players and the real state of the world. For each type, the type space tells us which possibilities that type considers possible, what they think about the other players' types and the state of the world. We can then define belief based on this. A type believes something if all the possibilities they consider possible are part of that thing. And then we can figure out higher order beliefs, what you believe about what others believe from this structure. There are both qualitative and probabilistic versions of type spaces, depending on whether the relationships between types and possibilities are defined using sets or probability distributions.
I've heard the term common knowledge a lot. What does that mean in this context?
Common knowledge is a really important idea when we're looking at how beliefs interact. We say that something is common knowledge if everyone knows it, everyone knows it, everyone knows it, everyone knows it, everyone knows that everyone knows it, and so on, forever. It's basically the strongest form of shared understanding, and it's a key part of how we analyze strategic behavior in epistemic game theory.
Okay, so we have these different ways to model the information in a game. But how do players actually make choices based on that information?
Well, that's where choice rules or decision rules come in. They basically tell us what a rational player should do based on their preferences and the information they have, which we represent using our game models. Some of the most important choice rules in epistemic game theory are strict dominance, maximization of expected utility, and admissibility, which is related to the idea of weak dominance.
And I remember from decision theory that there's a difference between making choices when you're uncertain about something and making choices when you know the risks involved, right?
That's right. When you're dealing with risk, you know the probabilities of all the possible outcomes. But when you're dealing with uncertainty, you don't have that information. In epistemic game theory, the choice rule we use often depends on whether we're modeling the player's beliefs using probabilities or not.
So let's go through these choice rules. First, maximization of expected utility. That sounds like it's really important for the Bayesian perspective we were talking about.
It definitely is. It's one of the most important ideas in Bayesian rationality. If we can quantify a player's preferences with utility functions and represent their beliefs with probabilities, then we can calculate the expected utility of an action. Basically, you take the weighted average of the utilities of all the possible outcomes, where the weights are the probabilities of those outcomes happening. The choice rule is then pretty simple. A rational player will pick the action that gives them the highest expected utility. We can define this formally and use it in type spaces and other probabilistic models of belief.
What about dominance reasoning? How does that help us make choices, especially when we don't have exact probabilities?
Dominance reasoning is most useful when you're uncertain about things. A strategy strictly dominates another strategy if it always gives you a better outcome no matter what the other players do. A strategy weakly dominates another if it's at least as good in all situations and better in at least one situation. The basic idea here is that players shouldn't choose strategies that are dominated by other strategies.
It's interesting that when we talk about dominance, we often think about mixed strategies, where you randomly choose between your pure strategies, even if we think players will end up choosing just one pure strategy in the end. Why is that?
That's a good question. The reason is that a pure strategy might be strictly or weakly dominated, not by another pure strategy, but by a mixed strategy. Even if a player is only going to choose one action, if there's a mixed strategy that would definitely give them a better outcome for strict dominance, or an outcome that's never worse and sometimes better for weak dominance, then choosing that pure strategy would be rational. So to really understand dominance, we need to consider all the possible mixed strategies as well.
And how do these ideas of dominance fit into the game models we've been talking about?
In both epistemic models, which are based on knowledge, and epistemic plausibility models, which use rank beliefs, we can define the live possibilities for an opponent's strategies. These are the strategies that the player thinks the opponent might actually use. In epistemic models, this depends on which possible worlds the player thinks are indistinguishable. In epistemic plausibility models, it depends on which worlds the player thinks are most plausible. We say a player's choice is ST rational, strictly dominance rational, if the strategy they chose isn't strictly dominated by any other strategy, considering only the live possibilities. And depuid rationality is defined the same way, but using weak dominance. And it's important to remember that if a player already knows what action they're going to take, that knowledge has to be considered when we're trying to decide if their choice is rational.
So there are some important connections between dominance and maximizing expected utility.
Absolutely. There's a basic principle that says a strategy strictly dominates another strategy only if the second strategy never maximizes expected utility when the first strategy does. And the other way around, if a strategy is never the best response to any belief the player might have, then it must be strictly dominated. For weak dominance, it's a bit more complicated. A strategy is weakly dominated only if there's no full support probability measure. That means a belief that gives every possible opponent strategy a probability greater than 0 for which that strategy is the best response. So basically, to avoid being strictly dominated, a strategy just needs to be the best response to some belief. But to avoid being weakly dominated, it has to be the best response to a belief that doesn't completely rule out any possibilities.
And if a strategy is strictly dominated, it stays strictly dominated even if the player gets more information, right?
That's right. If a strategy is strictly dominated based on a set of possible opponent strategies, it'll still be strictly dominated even if the player learns more and can narrow down that set of strategies. But that's not always true for weak dominance.
Okay, I think we have a pretty good understanding of the basics now. Let's talk about some of the main ideas in epistemic game theory. What were some of the first important insights that came from this approach?
Well, by focusing on how individuals make decisions within a clearly defined informational context, the epistemic perspective offered a bottom-up approach. This was very different from the top-down method used in classical game theory, where you just start with the solution concepts. Early work by Bernheim and Peirce on rationalizability and Robert Aumann's work on correlated equilibrium, which was based on Bayesian rationality, were really important for establishing this field. One of the main goals of epistemic game theory has been to provide epistemic characterizations of solution concepts. This means figuring out exactly what the players need to know and believe in order to act according to a specific solution concept.
And one of the most interesting results in this area is about the iterated removal of strictly dominated strategies, or ISDS, right?
Exactly. The most important findings is that if all the players are rational and there's common belief in rationality, then the only strategies that can be played are the ones that survive the process of repeatedly eliminating strictly dominated strategies. This shows how important it is to consider higher order information, what you believe about what others believe about rationality and so on, when you're trying to figure out what's going to happen in a game.
This idea of common belief in rationality seems like a really strong assumption, almost like an ideal. What does it mean for us philosophically to rely on this assumption?
Philosophers have had a lot of discussions about how strong the idea of common belief is. It basically assumes that everyone believes that everyone else is rational, and everyone believes that everyone else is rational, and so on, forever. But it's important to realize that for any specific game and any specific model of beliefs, you usually only need a finite number of levels of belief to get the outcome predicted by ISDS. Some people think that common belief should be seen as more of a theoretical benchmark, something that helps us understand what would happen if everyone was perfectly rational and knew that everyone else was perfectly rational. It's not necessarily something that always happens in real life. It's interesting that even though common belief of rationality means that players will only choose strategies that survive iterated strict dominance, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll reach a Nash equilibrium, which is what people often assume when they're thinking about rational play. The key takeaway here is that strategic reasoning is all about these higher order beliefs.
Just being rational yourself isn't enough to guarantee that you'll choose a strategy that survives iterated strict dominance. You also need to think about what other players believe about your rationality and their own. And there are still debates about exactly how many levels of belief are needed for different games and solution concepts.
How would players even get to a point where there's common belief in rationality? It doesn't seem very easy to achieve.
That's a great question. People have looked at this using dynamic epistemic logic. The idea is that if players keep publicly announcing that they're rational, basically, they just keep saying that they'll only do things that make sense, then they can gradually reduce the uncertainty about each other's rationality. And under certain conditions, this process of repeatedly announcing their rationality can lead to a state where the conditions for choosing iteratively non-dominated strategies are met. But in games with more than 2 players, these results usually rely on the assumption that players believe their opponent's choices are correlated, which adds another layer of complexity to the idea of independent beliefs.
Let's move on to backward induction in extensive games. These are games that happen in a sequence, right? Like you make one move, then your opponent makes a move, and so on.
Yes, that's right. In extensive games, which we often draw as game trees, the most famous solution concept is subgame perfect equilibrium. In games where everyone knows all the moves that have already been made, subgame perfect equilibrium is the same as backward induction. When we analyze backward induction from an epistemic perspective, we see how important it is to think about belief revision policies. This means figuring out how players change their beliefs when they see their opponents doing something they didn't expect.
And there's a pretty big debate about backward induction with people like Ullman and Stalnaker disagreeing about it, right?
Exactly. Robert Ullman showed that if there's common knowledge of substantive rationality, meaning that everyone will always act rationally at every point in the game, then the players have to follow the backward induction solution. But Robert Stalnaker argued that this isn't necessarily true, and the difference comes down to how they model belief revision. When a player sees their opponent doing something that doesn't fit with the backward induction solution, how should they change their beliefs about their opponent's rationality for the rest of the game?
Can you give an example of how this difference in thinking plays out?
Sure, let's look at the centipede game. In this game, 2 players take turns, and they can either take a slightly bigger share of a pot of money that keeps growing, or pass it to the other player. If a player takes the money, the game ends. Backward induction says that the first player should just take the money right away on their first turn. But when people actually play this game, they often keep passing for a few rounds. Ullman's result says that if everyone knows that everyone is always rational, then the first player should take the money immediately. But Stalnaker says that if the second player sees the first player passing on their first turn, they might change their mind about how rational the first player will be in the rest of the game. They might think that the first player has a different strategy or different preferences than they originally thought. Stalnaker's point is that we should evaluate a player's rationality at a specific point in the game based on the situation they're in at that point, considering how their beliefs would have changed based on what's already happened. He uses this analogy with Shakespeare and Hamlet. Just because you believe that if Shakespeare hadn't written Hamlet, no one else would have, that doesn't mean you have to believe that Hamlet wasn't written if you find out that Shakespeare didn't actually write it. In the same way, just because you see someone doing something unexpected in a game doesn't mean you should stop believing that they'll be rational in the future.
So it's all about how we understand these unexpected actions, right? Do we see them as irrational, or do we use them to update our beliefs about what the other player's thinking?
Exactly. Instead of assuming that an unexpected move means the player will be irrational in the future, there's the rationalizability principle and the related idea of forward induction. Forward induction says that players should try to make sense of their opponent's actions by assuming that they were rational in some way. So if your opponent does something that doesn't seem optimal based on your initial predictions, you should try to figure out a rational reason why they did that, and that new understanding can then change your beliefs about what they'll do next. To formally describe forward induction, we often use the idea of common strong belief in rationality. This means that players start by believing that everyone else is rational, and they keep believing that as long as they don't see any clear evidence that proves otherwise.
We've covered a lot of ground. Let's talk about some newer developments in epistemic game theory now. What are some of the areas where people are still doing research, and what are some of the new insights they've found?
One area that people are still studying a lot is the idea of Nash equilibrium. We know that ISDS, the iterated removal of strictly dominated strategies, is a useful tool, but it often doesn't give us a single prediction for what will happen in a game. So we have to ask, What conditions need to be met for players to choose strategies that form a Nash equilibrium? An important result from Offman and Brandenburger in 1995 gave us an answer based on mutual knowledge of strategy choices. They showed that in a game with two players, if both players know that each other is rational and they both have correct beliefs about what strategy the other player will choose, then the strategies they choose must form a Nash equilibrium.
But needing to have mutual knowledge of each other's strategies seems pretty demanding, especially since the players are supposed to be making their decisions independently. Some philosophers have questioned whether players can really know what their opponents will do in these situations.
That's a good point, philosophically speaking. Some people argue that if you need to know what the other player will do, then it's not really strategic interaction anymore, because it takes away the uncertainty and the need to think about what your opponent might do. But another way to look at this result is that it gives us an important epistemic foundation for Nash equilibrium as a solution concept. It shows us that a Nash equilibrium is a situation where all the strategic uncertainty has been removed. Once everyone knows what everyone else is doing, the only thing each player has to do is figure out if their own choice is the best response to what everyone else is doing. It describes a kind of stability that happens after everyone has done all their strategic thinking. The main point here is that common knowledge of rationality isn't strictly required for a Nash equilibrium, and it doesn't automatically guarantee a Nash equilibrium either. You can have a Nash equilibrium even if the players aren't sure if everyone is rational, and even if everyone knows that everyone else is rational, they might not end up at a Nash equilibrium.
What about admissibility and those cautious beliefs we discussed earlier? How has epistemic game theory dealt with the idea that players might not want to choose weakly dominated strategies?
That takes us into situations where a player doesn't have a single, obviously best choice. In these cases, a cautious player might not want to rule out any of their opponent's strategies that could be rationalizable, even if those strategies don't seem likely. This connects to the idea of weak dominance. A strategy is admissible if it's not weakly dominated by any other strategy. Trying to analyze what happens when players repeatedly eliminate weakly dominated strategies is much more complicated than doing the same thing with strictly dominated strategies, and it has led to some interesting paradoxes. One important idea that's come out of this is the idea of no extraneous beliefs, sometimes called privacy of tie-breaking. It means that a player shouldn't know how their opponent will choose between two equally good strategies. One way people have tried to deal with the tension between strategic reasoning, where you often have to rule out possibilities, and admissibility, where you're supposed to consider all the non-weakly dominated options, is by using lexicographic probability measures. In these measures, some possibilities are considered infinitely more likely than others. But there's an even deeper philosophical question here. If a player follows the principle of admissibility, should they also consider the possibility that other players might not be following it? This brings us to the idea of assuming something, which means treating it as infinitely more likely than the opposite. Figuring out the exact relationship between rationality, the assumption that everyone is rational, and the strategies that survive the process of repeatedly eliminating weakly dominated strategies is still a difficult problem that people are researching.
Wow, this is a real deep dive. Let's touch on the work people have been doing on incorporating unawareness. It seems like this goes against the usual assumption that everyone knows everything about the game.
You're right. This is a big change, and it deals with the limitation of traditional game theory. Game theory usually assumes that everyone knows everything about how the game works. But what happens when players aren't just uncertain about what their opponents will do or what the payoffs are, but they're actually unaware of some of the possible actions, outcomes, or even other players? Can our usual models deal with this kind of fundamental lack of awareness? Think about that Sherlock Holmes story where the dog didn't bark. The important clue wasn't something that happened, but something that didn't happen, something that someone who wasn't paying close attention wouldn't even notice. That shows the difference between simply not knowing something and not even realizing that it's a possibility.
How have researchers tried to model unawareness?
One way people tried to do it was by defining unawareness of something, let's call it E, as not knowing E, and not knowing that you don't know E, and so on forever. But that kind of definition, which relies on not being able to think about your own lack of knowledge, leads to problems and paradoxes. You can imagine situations where you're unaware of E, but you're aware that you're unaware of E, which doesn't really make sense. Formal results have even shown that you can't really define unawareness in a meaningful way within the standard frameworks of epistemic logic, if you want it to have certain properties that seem like they should be true. This has led to a lot of research on new models that can represent unawareness in games, and these models often change the basic structures of possible worlds and knowledge operators.
Finally, let's talk about this paradox of self-reference in game models. That sounds like a really tricky problem for the foundations of this whole field.
It is. When you choose a specific game model to analyze a strategic situation, you're making assumptions about which kinds of beliefs are possible and which ones aren't. So this leads to a really important question. Are there game models that don't make very many assumptions, models that can represent any possible combination of higher order beliefs? We know that universal structures exist for Harsanyi-type spaces, meaning that they can handle any combination of probabilistic beliefs that makes sense. But for Kripke-style models, which are based on knowledge and possibility, it's more complicated, and there's some limitations.
And this is where the Brandenburger-Keisler paradox comes in. What does this paradox tell us about the limits of our models?
The Brandenburger-Keisler paradox is a great example of a problem that comes from self-reference, and it shows us that there are limits to how well we can model interactive beliefs using the standard tools of game theory. Imagine Anne and Bob again, and this statement. Anne believes that Bob assumes that Anne believes that Bob's assumption is wrong. If you carefully think about what this statement means, using a framework for representing beliefs and assumptions that seems perfectly reasonable, you run into a contradiction. The statement ends up being true, if and only if it's false. This paradox happens because beliefs about assumptions can refer to themselves, especially when those assumptions are about what other people believe. Brandenburger and Keisler prove that there's no such thing as an assumption-complete type structure, even for simple kinds of beliefs about what other players will do. This tells us that we can't represent every possible combination of higher-order beliefs in our game models, at least not if we're using certain standard logical frameworks. There have been some positive results by limiting the types of beliefs we allow, but the Brandenburger-Keisler paradox reminds us that interactive beliefs are really complex, and that it's hard to come up with a completely general and consistent way to represent them.
This has been a really fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. So, for our listeners who are interested in philosophy, what are the main things they should take away from epistemic game theory?
I think the biggest takeaway is that epistemic game theory gives us a much deeper and more fundamental understanding of the assumptions we make in game theory. This is because it specifically models what the players know and believe. It shows us that higher order reasoning, thinking about what others believe, about what you believe, and so on, is a really important part of strategic interaction. And it shows that the rational choice in a game isn't just determined by the objective payoffs. It also depends on the specific information that the players have and the rules they're using to make rational decisions.
So it's not just about the game itself, but also about the game that's happening inside the players' minds.
Exactly. And the rational outcome depends on what's happening in those internal games.
Yeah.
What the players know, what they believe, and what they believe about what others know and believe.
Here's something to think about. How does our understanding of big philosophical ideas like rationality, belief, and even paradox change when we apply them to strategic interaction, where things are always changing and everyone is influencing each other? Think about the specific theorems and models we talked about today and how the ideas of awareness and self-reference can challenge our usual ways of thinking about knowledge. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.